As we track the spread of the system, there's a clear connection between some Egyptian hieroglyphic symbols, in particular the hieroglyphs that represented sounds, which we call the Egyptian phonemes. As we compare symbols from these various writing systems, we can see the adoption of similar characters from Egyptian to Minoan to Phoenician to early Greek to Greek and then to Latin. Even though we're not speaking or writing Latin today, for the most part we are using the Latin alphabet. The documentation of this evolution is fairly clear, except for these parts from Egyptian to Minoan and from Minoan to Phoenician. And that's where the Sinaitic or Proto-Sinaitic alphabet comes in. The clues to this development come from a site called Serabit el-Qadim. It was a rest stop for Egyptian slaves on the way to turquoise mines in the Sinai. The journey to the mines was long, difficult, and dangerous. The miners suffered from thirst, wild beasts, and snakes. The turquoise itself was incredibly valuable, but also problematic. With too much exposure to harsh sunlight or extreme heat, it would crumble or the color deteriorate from a heavenly blue to a pale green, and all of the miners' work would be in vain. In this remote location is an ancient shrine to the goddess Hathor and some graffiti. The alphabet there is called Proto-Sinaitic, meaning before Sinai. The script is similar to Egyptian hieratic script. If you remember, that was the less formal version of hieroglyphics. There are only 30 carved inscriptions at the site. One author theorizes that the writing was an informal code invented by outsiders, probably non-educated slaves, as an alternative to formal Egyptian language. Some hypothesize that this is the apocryphal site of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments. This single Sinaitic script gave rise not only to Phoenician, but also to Hebrew and Arabic. The symbols found there are what we call acrophonic, which means a pictorial symbol or hieroglyph that's used to stand for the initial sound of the depicted object. For example, a C for cat, or in this case, an A for aleph, which means a bull. The next mysterious link on the alphabet's magical journey is on the island of Minos, or Crete. This is what Crete looks like today, and it probably looked much the same back then when it was the ancient island of Minos. Pretty nice, and historical ruins too. The Minoans were Bronze Age traders associated with the story of the labyrinth and the worship of the Minotaur, which featured the sport of bull leaping. The artifact that makes them part of our story is this, the Phaistos disc. On it are 45 different symbols in a total work of just 241 signs, too few to decode. The symbols include a man in a plumed headdress, a hatchet, an eagle, a carpenter's square, an animal skin, and a vase. The writing is arranged in a spiral pattern stamped into both sides of a fired clay disc. The symbols are so consistent they may have been made by a set of stamps, an early version of movable type. And now to a civilization we know much more about, the Phoenicians and their alphabet. The Phoenicians were merchants and warriors. It was a rich and powerful civilization fueled by literacy. Written language is like a superpower to organize armies and navies and enable communication between seafaring groups. The Phoenicians traded all over the Mediterranean Sea. The alphabet associated with Phoenicia is called the Ras Shamra script from about 1500 BCE. Used for bureaucratic and commercial documents and to record myths and legends, the Ras Shamra script reduced cuneiform to a mere 32 characters. It was only recently unearthed in the ruins of the ancient city of Ugarit in today's northern Syria. The Ras Shamra script combines the phonetic system of the Proto-Sinaitic writing with cuneiform writing methods, pressing a stylus into clay. It consisted of all consonants. Many phonetic writing languages are derived from this Phoenician alphabet, including Hebrew, Sanskrit, Aramaic, Arabic, Greek, and Latin. Phoenician city-states were centers of power and trade along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. The oldest one was named Byblos, the Phoenician word for papyrus. If you remember, that is the paper made in Egypt from papyrus reeds. From the word Byblos comes Bible, meaning book. You may also have heard of Tripoli or Palmyra, but these are the places the towns in Pennsylvania were named for. My favorite Phoenician city-state is Tyre, the home of a special color called Tyrian purple. The city of Tyre was famous for this brilliant purple dye, produced by a fresh mucus secretion of a small sea snail called the murex. Huge, very stinky dye houses along the seashore exported this expensive royal cloth all over the Mediterranean. Dyes were worth their weight in silver in the 4th century BC. Another step along the alphabet's evolution was Aramaic. The gestural curves of the Aramaic alphabet evolved into both Hebrew and Arabic. Aramaic was probably the language that Jesus spoke, and it's still spoken in ancient Christian communities in Iraq and Syria. The next step from Egyptian to Minoan to Phoenician was to Greek. The Greek alphabet is highly efficient, based on phonetic sounds, and is easy to learn. There are 2 versions of it, Formal Greek and Greek uncials, a faster brushstroke version of the alphabet. Most Greek characters have a symmetrical form that fits within a square. There is a Greek legend that the mythical figure Cadmus dropped dragon's teeth into the ground, and wherever they landed, a soldier sprang up. Perhaps the dragon's teeth were letters that could raise an army. In real life, the warrior Cadmus may have brought the alphabet back home to Greece. The story goes that he was sent to retrieve his sister from Tyre after she was kidnapped by Zeus. He's credited by ancient Greeks with inventing the alphabet, agriculture, and civilization in general. However it arrived, the first proof that it is this bronze miniature chariot wheel covered with archaic Greek writing, which is only 6 inches in diameter. It was used for worship. This papyrus manuscript, containing the epic poem The Persians by the Greek writer Timotheus, is from the 4th century BCE. An excellent example of the Greek alphabet, it shows the symmetrical form and even visual rhythm that evolved. These qualities made the Greek alphabet the prototype for subsequent developments. Greek, like some other languages, was written in what is called boustrophedron or ox-turning style, alternately right to left, then left to right, like an oxen behind a plow. This religious stele with 4 figures is from 5th century BCE. The design excellence of Greek inscriptions is clearly shown in this fragment. By using a 3-sided square with a central dot for the E and a V-shaped horizontal line in the A, the designer engaged in a personal inventiveness within the form of the alphabet. This Greek wooden tablet from 3 CE shows the rounded uncials that allowed an A to be made with 2 strokes instead of 3, and an E to be made with 3 strokes instead of 4, thereby making it faster to write. The more formal letters were used when carving into stone or casting in metal, where more informal uncials were used, as in this example, when painting with a brush. Among other inventions, Greek writing was used in making these allotment tokens. In the Greek city-state, some public officials were elected and others were selected by lot by drawing tokens from a basket or vase. These Greek jurors' ballots from the 4th century BCE show how a juror could vote not guilty with the ballot having a solid hub, or a hollow-hubbed ballot was used to cast a guilty vote. As in other developing civilizations, the Greeks used signature seals to sign letters and documents. This scarabæoid seal depicts Hermes, the messenger of the gods. The other 2 seals show a dolphin and a horse seal from the same period, around 500 BCE. As you've seen in our other videos, Greeks were not the only culture who translated ancient stories from an oral tradition into a written tradition to preserve them. But Greek literature, drama, philosophy, and mathematics were preserved in manuscripts that became the roots of Western European culture and are familiar to Americans in forms such as Shakespearean plays and Euclidean geometry textbooks. Other lasting pieces of Greek culture include the concept of an elected democracy, classical architectural forms such as columns and pediments, and of course the Greek root words in the English language. As the Greek city-states grew in power and influence, their language systems spread. Next, to the first great civilization in Italy, the Etruscans. This Etruscan vase was made around 600 or 700 BCE. A prototype of an educational toy, the rooster-shaped toy jug is inscribed with the Etruscan alphabet. There are only a few existing examples of Etruscan characters, so most of what we know about the culture is deduced from the art and the objects themselves. This is an example of Greek mythology bridging into Roman mythology. You can also see the names of the characters in the Etruscan language. So what do we mean when we talk about the classical cultures of Greece and Rome? Of course, at the time, the classical period, people didn't know they were in a classical period. The word classics is derived from a Latin adjective, classicus, meaning belonging to the highest class of citizens. By the 2nd century AD, the word was used in literary criticism to describe writers of the highest quality. And by the 6th century AD, the word had acquired a second meaning, referring to pupils at a school, a class. The Romans ultimately adopted 21 of the original 26 Etruscan letters. We call this the Latin alphabet, or sometimes Roman characters. This pottery vase, called the Dueños inscription from the 5th to 7th century BCE, is possibly the oldest inscription in archaic Latin. It's hard to translate since there's no spaces between the words or the letters, and the engraving travels around the outside of these 3 interconnected pots, but the letters do show the modification from Etruscan to Latin. This kind of vessel, by the way, with many little individual bowls stuck together, was used in ceremonies, and the individual pots may have held offerings of sage or herbs, white poppy heads, grain, flowers, cakes of compressed fruit, honey, olive oil, wine, milk, or unwashed sheep's wool. Located in Trajan's Forum in Rome, this masterful example of capitalis monumentalis, monumental capitals, gives silent testimony to the ancient Roman saying, "The written word remains." The controlled brush drawing of the forms on the stone combines with the precision of the stonemason's craft to create letter forms of majestic proportion and harmonious form. It truly is a classic. The column, which was engraved to commemorate the Trajan victory in the Dacian Wars, was dated from about 100 CE. Meant to be read from below, the bottom letters of the engraving are slightly smaller to give it proper perspective. Some, but not all, of the divisions between words are marked with a dot, as shown here, and many words, especially titles, are abbreviated. In the inscription, the numerals are marked with a titulus, a bar across the top of the letters. The characters on the engraved column are the basis for the modern digital typeface Trajan, designed in 1989 by Carol Twombly for Adobe. Roman capitals featured the pointy end strokes that were named much later serifs. The serif may have been created from the beginning stroke of a brush, or some contend a chisel mark that started the engraving of a letter. And the simultaneous invention of the Roman arch may have influenced the curved shapes on letters like R, S, and P. As we saw in other writing systems, there was a less formal variation that was used in written manuscripts. These are called capitalis quadrata, or square capitals, from a manuscript by Virgil in 400 CE. The flat pen held at an angle produced thick and thin strokes and serifs. For the letter G, we can thank a specific Roman person, Spurius Carvilius Ruga. He allegedly invented the letter G to distinguish the C sound in the G versus K in Greek. He was also the first man in recorded history to open a private elementary school. Many of the remaining manuscripts from the classical era are written on sheepskin or parchment. Parchment was the substrate for writing. It was made from cowhide scraped thin, came into use in Greece and Rome when papyrus was scarce paper. One advantage it had over papyrus was that it had 2 good sides. The finest parchment was called vellum, and that word is related to veal, which came from calves and could be scraped so thin that you could see through it. Diplomas today are sometimes called sheepskins, and they're usually written on parchment. This inscription on a wall from Pompeii is from the 1st century CE. Over 1,600 messages, ranging from passages from Virgil to crude obscenities, were preserved under more than 12 feet of volcanic ash that fell on the city of Pompeii. You can get a feeling of what the streets might have looked like from this remaining wall. I got to visit Pompeii a long time ago, and one of the things I loved were these mosaics in the entryways of houses, and they just had different pictures of ferocious-looking dogs. And these very clear portrayals of what goes on inside were written over the doors of various rooms in a brothel, demonstrating once again that some things never change. In 410 CE, the Visigoths, the barbarians at the gates, sacked the city of Rome. However, more than that single event, there was a long decline in Roman power and authority with multiple causes. Some of these include an over-reliance on slave labor, an over-ambitious military expansion and the weakening of the Roman legions, corruption in the government, the rise of the Byzantine Empire and a shift of wealth and power towards Constantinople, and even possibly lead poisoning among the ruling classes from using lead vessels and water pipes. The fall of Rome was also linked with the rise of Christianity. This early painting of Jesus and his disciples in a Roman catacomb shows him dressed as a teacher rather than in a supernatural guise. Christianity was a small outsider cult for the first 3 centuries of CE, of the current era, until the Emperor Constantine became its patron at the beginning of the 4th century. This 2-foot-wide silver platter found in England dates from about the time the Roman legions were retreating from Britain back to Italy. Although the platter depicts the Roman gods Neptune and Bacchus, the owner was likely a follower of Christianity, which was not yet the dominant belief system in Europe. This combination of classical and Christian concepts is typical of the early Middle Ages. This is the age of illuminated manuscripts in Europe. Those include all the decorated and illustrated handwritten books produced from the late Roman Empire until the beginning of printed books. Most of them were about religious topics, sacred writings that held great meaning for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Because they were made with such extraordinary care and design sensitivity and were so incredibly expensive, they had to be made by a large organization or a wealthy, belonging to a wealthy donor. The format of these manuscripts is in codex-style books, or codices. They were made in parchment or vellum because paper didn't come to Europe until the 1000s. This is a wonderful example of a codex called the Codex Gigas, or Devil's Bible. Legend has it that it was created by a monk who sold his soul to the devil and was sentenced to be walled up alive. In order to get out of this penalty, he promised to create in one single night a book that would glorify the monastery forever and include all human knowledge. About midnight, maybe you know this feeling, he became sure he could not complete the task. So he made a special prayer, not to God, but to the fallen angel Lucifer, asking him to help finish the book in exchange for his soul. So illuminated manuscripts are called illuminated because the gold leaf and precious jewels that were used to make them shine like they're lit from within, and also because the meaning of the text is illuminated by the images. So the light could be seen as shining literally from the book into your brain. Often these manuscripts weren't signed, so all we know the artist by is things like the master of the other manuscript. You might need the skins of 300 sheep, so again, they were a very large investment. They took time and manpower to copy, probably thousands of hours to make a bot, or more than 5 years. Back even in their day, they were precious, and now they're priceless. There are some examples left from the classical period of Greek and Roman art. We have some fragments that show numerous small illustrations, almost like a contemporary comic book. Unfortunately, with the burning of the library at Alexandria in Egypt, that was the Library of Alexander the Great, many examples of classical codices have been lost, but there are a few that remain. This manuscript tells a story by Virgil. It belongs to the Vatican, and the classical style of it dates from pre-Christian Rome around the early 400s. It shows 2 scenes from the life of the Trojan priest Laocoon. merged into one illustration. He was associated with the fall of Troy and the Trojan horse. He tried to warn people. And in his death, he was attacked with his 2 sons by giant sea serpents sent by the gods. His story is a favorite one for artists. And a progression in writing, we have uncials from the Gospel of St. Matthew. So this familiar concept of uncials, which are brush-stroked, rounded characters, but these are in Latin as opposed to Greek. This dates from about the 8th century CE. And here you can see how the shapes of the Latin letters mimic the shapes of the earlier Greek uncials. By the 6th century CE, we have a new development, half uncials, with ascenders and descenders. So medieval life in Italy, much like in other parts of Europe, after the fall of Rome around 476, the centralized Roman government and their soldiers retreated, and chaos ensued. Power was concentrated in the hands of feudal lords, whoever had the strongest army or could rule by, might. There was also constantly being besieged by barbarian or Viking or Norseman raiders. Most people had large families, didn't travel very much, pretty much subsistence living unless you were a lord or a knight. The land went generally to the first son, primogeniture, and there was a low level of literacy as speaking and writing Latin eroded. This manuscript is called the Theodore Psalter. It contains many of the Psalms and the Odes from the Old Testament and was made in 1066 by Theodoros of Caesarea, who was the presbyter of the Studios Monastery in Constantinople for the abbot Michael. It features illuminated letters in gold and dramatic illustrations like this one, which shows what happens if you say mean things about your professors. Between 500 and 1000 CE, successive waves of conquerors, the Ostrogoths, the Byzantines, Langobards, Franks, and Arabs, captured and recaptured strategic cities in the Italian peninsula. This Langobardic pin is from 600 CE and has an ancient Etruscan cameo from 500 years earlier set in the center. The Langobards were invaders from northern Europe, and in my opinion, the ornamental gold designs around the edges are fairly crude compared to the delicacy of the chariot rider cameo in the center. The designs carved into this ivory and copper reliquary from around 1000 CE seem related to Arabian lattice work or possibly influenced by Celtic knotwork. It's from northern Italy. The legacy of the Roman Empire was faded but present. Many Roman roads and bridges remain serviceable, and monumental art like the Colosseum is everywhere in evidence. The Roman aqueduct was a channel used to transport fresh water to highly populated areas. Aqueducts were amazing feats of engineering given the time period. As water flowed into the cities, it was used for drinking, irrigation, and to supply hundreds of public fountains and baths. The aqueducts and monumental architecture lasted long after the empire had withdrawn. Another interesting metaphor of the survival of classical Greece and Rome into the Middle Ages from an unexpected direction has recently been uncovered in documents from this monastery in northern Africa. Using advanced spectrometry and X-rays, researchers have discovered several Greek texts that underlay a translation into Syriac, a major literary language throughout the Middle East. This overtext is in Syriac. And here you can see the Greek text that was covered over. Similarly, underneath this gospel in Arabic is an illustrated Greek medical text with diagrams. In short, when we look at medieval works from Greece and Rome, we see that the Dark Ages were perhaps not as dark on the Mediterranean shores. In Italy and Greece, cultures from around the area continually intersected. Power, wealth, and culture were concentrated in city-states, including the commercial centers of Venice, cultural capitals of Byzantine Greece, and the seat of the Catholic Church in Rome. Nevertheless, we call the period from 1400 to 1650 the Renaissance, or the rebirth, of human creativity. The spread of ideas was rapidly increased during this time with the development of the printing press. Printing enabled the spread of the pagan classics like the Odyssey and the Iliad, and a rediscovery of Greek mathematics and Roman engineering. It was a period of secular rather than religious thought and philosophy. The Catholic Church began to lose the power and authority it had wielded in the Middle Ages, and the ideas of Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation spread across Europe. There was an appreciation of worldly pleasures like wealth, food, art, and music, and a belief in personal independence, individual expression, and human genius. Italian explorers like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Amerigo Vespucci sailed under the flags of various European monarchs to create the Age of Discovery, and Italian masters like Da Vinci and Michelangelo revolutionized visual art with a renewed interest in realism and the study of nature. The Renaissance of classical literature and the work of the Italian humanists are closely bound to an innovative approach to book design. With more and more readers and more writers, there were more affordable, high-quality, and low-quality books. During the early Renaissance, the art of manuscript illumination flourished in Italy alongside that of painting, with the formation of regional schools and centers of production. Essentially a small painting on parchment, this image appears to have been created as an independent object for private devotion. Many of the famous artists who painted altarpieces and frescoes in 15th century Tuscany were also involved in the decoration of choir books for the most important churches. In this illuminated musical score, the scene of apostles witnessing the miraculous Assumption of the Virgin has been transformed by the depiction of a monstrous green dragon, whose body forms the opening letter A of the chant. Most important commissions centered around the Pope's court, where Michelangelo's models were transferred onto parchment by the most famous 16th century illuminator, Giulio Clovio. These works represent the final glorious moments of manuscript painting in Italy. Venice was the most sophisticated city in Europe. It had canals instead of streets, a nautical city that created another world. Venice is a cluster of islands that is only connected by bridges and waterways. The only way to reach the city was by boat. It had a stable republican government led by a doge, meaning duke in the local dialect. It had a lot of wealth from trade, especially from salt and spices, and a unique location as a gateway between Europe and Byzantium. It was a self-governing city-state ruled by an elected senate overseen by the doge, who was like an emperor. No, not that kind of doge. In September of 1469, in order to bring the new technology to their community, the Venetian Senate granted Johann de Spira a 5-year monopoly on printing in the city. It was the first monopoly on printing granted by a European government. Shown is the binding of the Greek philosopher Pliny's Natural History, printed by de Spira. Among his other innovations, de Spira produced the first typographic book with printed page numbers. His early Italian books have a new elegance in design and a new clarity in the design of the letter forms. This typography from an early book printed in 1469 by de Spira shows how the vertical stress and the sharp angles of the German textura style were modified by Italians to a more organic unity of horizontal, vertical, diagonal forms. Nicholas Jensen was a French engraver who was also called to Venice and further refined the look of Roman letter forms. In this side-by-side example, you can see that the biggest change from the German printed books and the Italian printed books was the adoption of the Roman capital-style letter forms as text. A new standard of excellence and readability was established with wider letters, lighter tone, and a more even texture of black strokes on the white ground. Note the beauty of the spaces between the letters and within each letter form. The overall page design as well was much less crowded, with text centered in the middle or compressed into the middle and a wider margin around the outsides. This version of the Jensen typeface was released by Adobe Systems in 1996. It was based on the Venetian old-style text cut by Jensen in 1470. With this new industry came new symbols. Printers' marks are essentially logotypes. One of mankind's oldest symbol is the orb and cross motif. It's found even in a chamber at the Cheops Pyramid in Giza. Dozens of printers adapted this mark. The globe and the cross signify a divine power when held as a prop in portraits. Another symbol that formed a component of these marks was the so-called Lorraine cross, a cross with an upper bar. It was also an old mark. In Sumeria, it was the ideogram for rulership, a shepherd's crook. It was adapted for use later as the emblem of an archbishop of the Catholic Church, and it became the arms of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who granted its use by the Knights Templar. It's sometimes called the Templar cross. The use of printers' marks were evolved from signature marks, which came about when printing a book. Signatures are sections of 8 pages that are sewn together. So to make sure that signatures are placed in correct order, early printers used a number or a symbol, called a catchword, at the bottom of the page. Different printers in different cities used different styles to differentiate their pages, which evolved into trademarks for the individual firms. This mark from 1481 is attributed to Andreas Torresanus. And this more ornate mark is from Laurentius de Rubai in 1482. His shop was about 55 miles southwest of Venice. This mark is similar, but from a printer in Spain, Barcelona. And this version with the upside-down cross of Lorraine was adopted by the Venetian Society of Printers, which was a guild that you paid a membership to join and granted you the right to do business in Venice. And oddly enough, it might look familiar to you because the National Biscuit Company, Nabisco, adopted the same symbol and pressed it into Oreos. It's still there today. Okay, into the Renaissance. One of the key ideas of the Renaissance is humanism. That's the philosophy of human dignity and worth. It defined man or woman as capable of using reason and scientific inquiry to achieve both an understanding of the world and an understanding of the self. This is a turning away from the medieval beliefs in God, magic, and the church toward a new concern for human potential and human value. As a result, there was less anonymity among writers, artists, manuscript printers, and illustrators. From 1475 to about 1574, there was a century producing some of the most harmonious and delightful books ever produced from Italian presses. Some new ideas that were introduced at this time are the title page, some special bindings, italics, the space between paragraphs, the semicolon, and the comma. At that time, Venice was the Silicon Valley of Europe. It was the home of printing, dozens of shops locked in cutthroat competition to come out with the newest, best thing. One innovative publisher was the group led by Erhard Ratdolt, Peter Loslin, and Bernard Mahler. They created this first title page used in a book, and it was even in verse. The printers' names are on there, and the 3-sided border became a kind of trademark of Ratdolt. One of their masterpieces was the Calendarium. It listed both past and future eclipses, which were predicted not by magic, but by science. In Ratdolt's 2-color design, a grid of metal rules brings order and legibility to the data and the diagrams of the eclipses. In another spread from the book, an interactive element was introduced. The 2 top circles are printed on heavy paper, cut out and mounted over the larger woodcut in the back with tape and a string. This might be the first die cut and manual tip-in a book. And on this page, there was a 3-part mathematical wheel chart for calculating the solar cycles. You can see here the heritage of illuminated capital letters married with a more regular printed type. This is another print of a classic book, Euclid's Geometry Elementa, or Elementary Geometry, printed by Ratdolt in 1482. A dazzling white-on-black design brackets the text, and incredibly fine-line diagrams in the wide margin visually explain Euclid's terms. The color in the decorative border and the initial was later added by hand. In another spread from Euclid's Geometry, you can see the wide outer margin that was maintained throughout the book to hold the explanatory diagrams. The firm of Giovanni and Alberto Alvis invented and collected these beautiful metal ornaments called fleuron. Fleurons is French for flowers. These were called printer's flowers and were used on title page designs and as fillers in short lines that left blank areas in text blocks. Metal type ornaments rather than hand illustrations sped up the printing process. Along with classical and biblical literature, the new art of printing helped people spread technical knowledge. This is a sketch of illustrations that were commissioned in an Italian book about military techniques. Freely drawn in brown pen and ink, the illustrations have brown and ochre washes applied. When those same illustrations were converted to woodcuts for printing, they lost some detail and gestural line quality, but the basic layout and the ideas of the technology remain the same. This book of military strategies was the first book with technical illustrations and is dated 1472. And here's my main man, Aldus Manutius, master printer. Aldus established the Aldine Press in Venice to realize his vision of publishing the major works of the great thinkers of the Greek and Roman worlds. He hired important scholars and skilled technical personnel to staff his press and became known for its editorial authority and scholarship. This Aldine Press logo, meaning make haste slowly, his books were so widely renowned that other printers started stealing his logo and copying it, and it's still in use today by the publishing company Doubleday. Here's an example of his italic type, called italic because it's from Italy. It was meant to convey the informal feeling of handwriting, and also saves paper because the letter forms are more vertically condensed than the conventional rounded type. Other typographic innovations by the Aldine Press were the comma and the semicolon. As the model for Garamond in the 16th century, this typeface became the prototype for 2 centuries of European graphic design. The typeface Bembo, designed in 1929, was named after Pietro Bembo and based on this type. The one-line intervals of space separating the information into 3 areas introduces light and order into the page, creates contrast. This classic tale by a Greek author features graceful illustrations by an anonymous artist. The woodcut images represent the best illustrations of their period and are exquisitely blended typography, helping to produce a book of serenity and grace. Unfortunately, the designer of the woodcuts, probably a Florentine, has never been identified. In the Renaissance, there was a growing interest in collecting and owning books as a mark of learning and wealth. Special value was placed on texts from the antique world that were uncovered in monastery collections and copied in the new humanist script for special patrons. This famous page depicts the worship of the pagan god Priapus, a reminder that this is a story from the ancient pagan world of Greco-Roman gods. Collectors were interested in luxurious printed volumes like this one with extensive woodcut illustrations. Here, the Aldine Press attains an elegant and dynamic asymmetric layout with an ingenious solution for odd line lengths. The press did not only publish pagan works, but also religious manuscripts, or actually anything that he thought would sell well. It's in this illustration of St. Catherine of Siena that he first uses italics in a little book within a book, meant to imitate handwriting. Aldus Manutius also developed some small pocket books. They were smaller than any other books in previous eras, and more economical by being set in the italic type font. These libelli portatiles, portable little books, were made from 1501. This edition of Petrarch was customized by its owner with lavish illumination. In this portable book of the Iliad and the Odyssey, printed in 1504, you can see the italic type and also a small area that's left for the initial letters and illumination. Typography and printing was not the end of developments in handwriting. Scribes, displaced by the printing press business, still worked as writing teachers and published books to instruct in formal and semi-formal script styles. Literacy was growing and writing was practiced by a larger, non-secular audience, and people needed to learn how to do legal and commercial handwriting for business applications. These are illustrations from the period of quill pens that were commonly used, made from either a bird's feather or a porcupine quill. And on the right you can see the position someone's using to hold their pen for writing, and maybe a tattoo on their wrist. One of the superstars of handwriting, which is kind of funny that there is such a thing, was Lodovico degli Arrighi. He was the author of the first book demonstrating how to write in Chancery script. Chancery script was an adaptation of handwriting called Scriptura Humanistica. The samples of the handwriting in the books were reproduced using woodblock prints, and Chancery script was used for financial reporting and memos. Here's the beautiful introduction page for a section of his book called How to Sharpen a Pen. This is proof that no brief is too small or too insignificant to make a masterpiece. He also included samples of scripts by other Italian writing masters, including these beautiful initial caps. He called his special style of initial caps Lettura Imperiale, imperial letters or royal letters. This is a book by another writing master, Giovanni Antonio Taglienti, kind of pasta to me. And this is a close-up of his distinctive initial caps. Another page by Tagliente shows a common exercise for students learning to do handwriting. This kind of scroll work is related to Celtic knots. Here are some contemporary illustrations of how to make your own quill pen. The first step is to catch a goose. Everything after that is easy. And as we move into the Enlightenment era, another typographic master comes along, Giambattista Bodoni. In Italy, he led the way in evolving new typefaces and page layout, which resulted in a whole new category of Roman type called modern. And of course, that was modern then. It's not as modern now, but the type classification is still modern. It was a more mathematical, geometric, and mechanical appearance of the current type style, unbracketed, which means straight serifs, and the serifs were hairline with thin strokes trimmed to the same weight as the hairline serifs. The pages were open and simple with very big margins, wide letter and line spacing, and large areas of white space on the page, as you'll see. In my opinion, these are some of the most beautiful page designs in all of printed history. This is a title page from 1771. And Bodoni seems to have continually refined and simplified the page design. It just gets better and better, prettier and more delicate. This is a title page from his masterpiece Manuale Tipografico in 1818. You can see the crisp clarity of his letter forms echoed by the Scotch rules, which are the thin and thick ruled lines around the borders. And a peek inside of that masterpiece shows you the alphabet that bears his name today, Bodoni. This is an example of a fully refined modern style type classification. Now there are many versions of the typeface he designed available in digital formats. If you Google it, over 300 versions of Bodoni come up. The most closely hewn to his original engravings are the Bauer Bodoni fonts. Okay, and as we move further into the 19th and 20th century, we roll into the Industrial Revolution. This amazing poster advertises the idea of gas lighting as well as the product, that lamp in the lower right-hand corner. The perfect art form for this new fast-paced urban world was the street poster. One of the greatest figures in the history of poster art was Leonardo Cappiello. After Lautrec and Mucha, he became the leading poster designer in Paris for almost 20 years and is known as the father of modern advertising. But he's Italian. Cappiello's posters consistently display a joyful and exuberant energy, like this Cinzano poster from 1910. He created a new functionalist style of graphic art, a single bold image that grabbed the viewer's attention and created personality for brands. This is one of my favorite posters of all time from 1906, an advertisement for a French brand of absinthe, which was colloquially known as the Green Devil. His genius was in creating just the right character to express the personality of each product. On this poster, there's a headline that says, "The Sun in a Glass." This poster for the product Thermogene claims to generate heat and fight coughs, rheumatism, and other symptoms. Thermogene was a product made of soft orange cotton that was meant to be applied as a plaster to heat up any part of the body. The active ingredient was hot pepper, and this poster made it famous. The formula of a single object and a joyful character is repeated in this ad for vermouth. And this poster advertises the Italian shoe company Unique, cleverly squeezing 6 shoes into one poster. Unique was the first shoe factory to market itself as a luxury brand, capitalizing on the Italian reputation for handmade leather products. Even today, we think of Italian leather goods and purses as being high quality and custom crafted. A style called Grafica Italiana really begins with the staccato typography produced in the early 1900s by the futurists Filippino Tommaso Marinetti and Fortunato de Pero, and other members of the futurist movement, influenced designers and artists all over the world. The futurists were philosophers and fine artists who sought to free typography from the constraints of vertical and horizontal lockups and make it feel more like sound. They were trying to synthesize the idea of hearing and seeing. Influenced by modern signage and the noisy modern world, they celebrated, for a brief moment, noise, machines, war, and violence. This is a painting by Fortunato de Pero, and you can see how he's using some of the Cubist principles developed by the avant-garde in French with a uniquely Italian spin. One of his most famous works, de Pero bound this book with industrial bolts. It contained his portfolio of work. Ultimately, the futurist aesthetic was applied to commercial work, as shown here in ads for Campari. Sometimes the abstraction maybe didn't work so well. This ad for Pellegrino seems to have a robot wrestling a number 3. I think they're drinking Pellegrino through a straw. And this is the cover of Typographia, a magazine started by the designer Modiano in 1931. The periodical was devoted to printing and promoting a constructivist approach to type, also using that in its own design. According to typographic standards of the 1930s, this layout was very rigorous and elegant, but also symmetrically contrived. The landmark year in Italian graphic design was 1933, when a team of progressive designers, printers, and photographers started the magazine Campo Grafico, and Studio Borgheri was founded in Milan by the designer and photographer Antonio Borgheri as a bastion of international style graphics. The studio connected the dots between Italian and Swiss graphics like no one had before, bringing modern principles to corporate graphic design. An incredible amount of work was produced with a stellar roster of designers, including Italian artists like Fortunato de Pero, Armando Milani, and Swiss masters Max Huber, Roberto Sambonet, and Walter Balmer, plus dozens of others. The studio revolutionized corporate communications by introducing radical notions like spare typography, photomontage, and geometric minimalism. In the post-war years, Italian companies like Pirelli and Olivetti were designing innovative, category-defining products. And growing Swiss pharmaceutical companies like Glaxo had plenty of money to spend. The combination of great designers, big clients, and a forward-looking aesthetic helped the studio take on projects from printed matter to ads to packaging and produce stellar work well into the 80s until the death of the studio founder, Borgheri. Their work was commemorated in this retrospective book in 1981. Rare copies of it are selling today for thousands of dollars. Another example of outstanding corporate identity stems from the office machine product company Olivetti. Olivetti's director of corporate communications believed in the modernist ideal, and because the products were so new, they were sort of like the Apple computer of their day. They lent themselves well to being interpreted in abstract symbols, for example, this typewriter. Products like this bright red typewriter from the 1960s are icons of mid-century design themselves, and even today are an interior designer's dream accessory. Olivetti had one of the first and arguably the best ever in-house graphic design departments, founded in 1937 and headed up by the Italian designer Giovanni Pintori from 1940 to 1967. Under Pintori's direction, Olivetti created bold graphics, ads, and showrooms that harnessed the selling power of great design, but carried it off with a nostalgia-provoking dose of pure flair and mid-century cool. Check out the retro-futuristic hipness of this Olivetti showroom in Barcelona with adding machines inside of space-age bubbles. Into the 1970s, we'll take a look at the dramatic campaigns for Benetton by the photographer Oliviero Toscani. For decades, he helped make Benetton clothing a huge name with so-called shockvertising, provocative, socially progressive ads that spurred outrage and drew headlines. Toscani helped move a small family-owned company into a global powerhouse. It's a perfect example of the union of a photographer and a fashion company being a case of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. 1 + 1 makes something far greater than 2. What started as just graphic images of people from all over the world wearing the colorful clothes of the knitwear company with the logo United Colors of Benetton became something much bigger. As the campaign went on and the ads got more and more attention, the play on the words United Colors became more and more political and controversial. At some point, it became kind of a game to see how the company would outdo itself each year with shocking imagery for every new season. They took on controversial topics with more and more hard-hitting imagery, including this dramatic shot of a family comforting a dying patient of AIDS who looks eerily Christ-like. In the same series was this image of colorful condoms, somehow connecting again to the simple tagline about United Colors. This was one of the more shocking images for the simple concept that everyone is the same inside. This image of identical blood vials with different ethnic name labels ran in the same series. Ultimately, Toscano was fired in 2020 for making insensitive remarks on radio about a bridge collapse in Italy, so evidently there was a line that couldn't be crossed. And on that note, I will say ciao and pick up the conversation about Italian designers next semester in the modern era.